Initiation. The Rwby fanfiction includes OC characters. KJ Flanders Osipov. The first strike decides the outcome of a fight. That's the way it works in a battle between the light and darkness, whether they be humans, faunas, or creatures of grim, whether they are controlling their own will or unable to do so, whether they be enemies, or perhaps even friends. KJ was running around the Emerald Forest without any consideration. There was no real reason for danger, but he had vague hopes of matching up with someone competent on such an important day. Although to tell the truth, he would have preferred to work alone. The initiation day at Beacon Academy had arrived, and KJ felt more than ready to belong to it. The boy stopped suddenly when he noticed a strange smell coming from nowhere. His heart began to beat faster, and his fear came to the surface when an inaudible tinkling sound was produced behind his back. KJ had always been a good student, as well as an excellent fighter. For this reason, the boy knew by heart all the possible grim he could face that day to prove his worth, and that tinkling and deadly scent could only mean one thing: he was close to a king. Without thinking, KJ turned round and squeezed his left arm tightly. Immediately he slipped his coin and felt the whippings of electricity activating in every cell of his body. But most of it was concentrated in that arm. He stared at King Tjatu, the gigantic two-headed serpent that lunged at him mercilessly. KJ had to dodge those fangs with great speed and managed to strike a hard blow to one of the heads. The white head of the serpent shouted a peculiar cry of pain, but the black head struck KJ's body hard, and he fell to the ground with regret. He tried to get up quickly, thinking of some way out, for he had not warmed up enough to face a monster of that caliber alone. But KJ knew he could take him down, even though the boy was easily missed in the crowd and could even be mistaken for someone fragile. On the battlefield the situation was very different. His gaze was capable of transmitting a great hidden power that housed his soul, and his guts and boldness were such that the blood-colored eyes of the remaining serpent's head scanned him for a few seconds before attacking, and those were the seconds KJ needed most. This time it was his right arm, drowned in waves of blue fire, that cut the large serpent in half, leaving it like a rag doll that had been forgotten. KJ straightened slowly and crossed his arms over his chest as his deep brown hair glinted, as moonlight would reflect off a still lake, sharp and blinding. Immediately he heard a warm applause at the bottom of the forest. Cowardly, he scanned the leaves of the trees, until he finally met the person who was watching him, a blue. KJ sighed and his arms returned to normal. He regretted seeing air in the eyes because that means that she was now his partner that day. He hated the idea of having her as a couple. Clearly, he didn't need anyone, much less a gun user. He did not want to discredit her, but he felt that this was the option chosen by cowards. One second thought, if he wouldn't have such amazing qualities in both arms, he might as well be like Kara Blue. That was amazing. I bet you'll be an exceptional student. Thank you, Ara. Why didn't you attack the Grim? Not for nothing, Flanders. But if we're going to work together today, I'd like to stay out of trouble. Do you understand me? Our goal is not to kill today. I just want to find the relics and get back to the safety of the academy. KJ perceived the bossy tone of her voice, but he decided to ignore it. How boring, KJ thought. But he smiled and accepted Era's condition. He thought it was better that way because he wasn't sure he wanted to show the others everything he was capable of doing at first. He was tired of being looked at with fear. He didn't want to be as feared as he was in the past. But he only got those looks when people were aware of his power. Off the field, he seemed like an altogether different person, shedding the serious demeanor he used as a hunter and displaying a gentler side of his personality. He had hoped to graduate along with the other future hunters at his old school, but the headmaster of Beacon, known as Professor Ozpin, had apparently been watching a few select prodigies and allowing the most talented of those early entrants to this prestigious institute. Naturally, KJ was one of them. graduating from his previous institute 1 year early, when he was 16. While he was grateful to enter Beacon at such an early stage, he couldn't help but feel a little dejected leaving his old friends behind. Here he was alone, and so far, he had only managed to strike up a conversation with 2 of the students at the academy. After an eventful first day at Beacon, KJ and Era continued walking through the forest, meeting another couple of students along the way. Together they arrived at the middle of the forest, where KJ could see several familiar faces from the previous day, the day of their arrival. Such people would be the future Team RWBY and Team JNPR. It was initiation day. They had made it to the temple at the center of the wood. Although KJ had been told not to get involved with the other pair's affairs if he could help it by his combat partner Rara, KJ was concerned about his new partner's behavior because he didn't want anyone to dictate to him on the battlefield. When KJ exchanged a glance with Ruby in that forest, his breath stopped for a moment. He immediately regretted not having played with her as a couple and noticed that she seemed a little uncomfortable with her partner, a girl named Vice. On that first day, he had made his way from the airship exit, trailing behind several gaggling groups of older students while a blonde boy rushed past time and knocked him sideways as his hands clasped over his mouth, a look of sheer desperation on his face. Poor guy, KJ thought. He even heard a couple of girls call him the vomit boy earlier. KJ had decided to take his time making his way to the entrance of the main building, taking a scenic route by strolling around the front gardens of the grounds. It was a warm, humid kind of day, early September, where the leaves seemed to hold onto tree branches for their life until they were ready to flutter to the ground. He looked up at the blue sky momentarily, a slight breeze pushing his dark hair away from his forehead. All he could hear was the fading sounds of jeering students and the chirping of a few birds nearby as he closed his chestnut-colored eyes. Peace. But peace could only last for a moment. The birds scattered from the trees as a loud bang erupted from what could only be the main pathway to the school's entrance. KJ's eyes furrowed as he hastily made his way towards the sound of the sudden noise, curious to see if this was part of an early initiation ceremony, although he had heard that wasn't until the following day. What he found startled him even more than he imagined. A small girl dressed in black and red clothing lay alongside a huge weapon, her eyes closed, her eyebrows furrowed slightly in what could only be assigned as pain, fear, or anxiety, or possibly all 3. He crept up to her quietly, almost nervous that this was some kind of trap set to test his abilities. But she looked so young and defenseless, so KJ eventually decided to speak up. "Are you okay? Should I call a nurse?" No, please don't. HMPH? The girl had almost instantaneously risen out of her lying position and jumped up to place her small hands over his mouth, not allowing him to complete his call for the school's medical staff. He grunted in surprise as her expression changed from panic to pure embarrassment, her hands quickly retracting from his face as her pale cheeks began to flush as crimson as parts of her clothing. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to jump on you like that. It's just that, well, I've just kind of blew up a girl's crystals." And then she got mad and started yelling, and then another girl came over and helped me out until the angry girl left. But then she left too, so I just lay down on the ground for a bit, and then you came over and started calling for medical aid, and I could have unintentionally made your first day even more traumatizing. Yeah, pretty much. KJ chuckled quietly at the girl's matter-of-fact response. She was interesting, that was for sure. Besides, KJ was a little surprised by the color of her eyes. That girl had the most amazing eyes he'd ever seen. They were totally silver, like the eye of a hurricane, and, despite being clear, they had something deep inside that made KJ pale. That's when he remembered ever reading that those eyes were what a Grimm feared the most. "Sorry about that. Ha ha ha. I'm KJ Flanders. By the way, nice to meet you, KJ. I am Ruby. Ruby rose. For some reason, he didn't feel awkward around her. Despite only meeting her, she gave off an easygoing energy, prompting him to continue his conversation with her, silently willing her to fall in step with him towards the school building. She complied and they both strolled slowly down the cobbled pathway, quietly looking down at their boots until KJ decided to start the conversation again. So, you look a little young to be enrolled here at Beacon. How did that happen? KJ regretted asking that question, as he noticed Rwby blushing. Well, her voice trailed for a moment, as though she was finding it difficult to phrase her words. After a momentary pause, she shrugged and continued, I may have coincidentally bumped into a huntress linked to Beacon while fighting a dust thief. This may have allegedly led to an early invitation to the academy. Allegedly. Rwby grinned and snickered quietly. They began to walk up the steps to the entrance doors. Honestly, for KJ, those four walls represented his entire future. His responsibilities now as a future hunter weighed him down more than he cared to admit. Sometimes his attention to detail was likely to slip in these uneventful days. So with the new challenges offered to him, he was likely to advance at an even faster rate. With a little competition, he could become the best of the best. And that was the plan. However, he was more curious about Ruby Rose than he had anticipated. She looked so innocent, so unable of causing harm to anyone, that it was almost frightening that she was even younger than he was, that she was deemed the biggest prodigy to enter these doors. What was that weapon? Anyway, so, nice weapon you got there. He gestured towards the huge scythe Ruby had lugged over her shoulder. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized she hasn't minimized her weapon yet, but smiled fondly as she showcased it proudly to him. Yeah, this is Crimson Rose. She's an original high-caliber sniper scythe. Pretty cool. Huh? A scythe user? That's pretty rare and pretty difficult to use well. Yeah. My Uncle Crow whipped me into shape back at Signal though. Crimson Rose and I have been inseparable since. She beamed widely and KJ looked down at the ground, bewildered at the strangeness of everything already mentioned in this conversation. And it only got weirder with the introduction of the second and only other person he had managed to get to know on his first day at Beacon. Whoa. What's that? A blonde-haired boy gaped unapologetically at the scythe Ruby had still not put away, pointing at it in shocked adoration before remembering to compose himself and struggling into a delayed prideful stance. I mean, hey guys, the name's Johnny Arc. Short, sweet rolls of a tongue. Ladies love it, do they? He and Ruby replied instantaneously, sharing a quizzical yet amused glance, their eyebrows raised jokingly as they turned back to the student they had previously only known as the one who threw up on the ship. Not yet. But they will. Johnny defended himself quickly as Ruby smiled dryly at his flustered yet kind expression. His nervousness was strangely endearing, and as they quickly struck up a conversation with him, it became apparent that KJ and Ruby could be on another level from some of the other new students. Or maybe Johnny was feigning inexperience. Nevertheless, KJ enjoyed the afternoon they spent together before the opening speech and dinner that evening. It had been only one relatively short conversation, and yet KJ had hoped to find Ruby once he landed in the forest during initiation day. He searched in vain and he ended up with Era instead. After making their way to the center of the Emerald Forest, he and his partner joined the small group of students at the temple and began watching the havoc being wreaked before them upon their arrival. Era scowled while her teal eyes narrowed as black feathers fluttered to the ground like rotting leaves. This was never supposed to happen. They were never supposed to be in this situation. The girl Ruby had partnered up with was clutching to the Nevermore for dear life as Ruby plummeted to the ground, landing in a tree alongside Johnny. Meanwhile, some other unfamiliar students had traveled to the temple on Anasa, and another blonde girl was screaming at everyone to calm down amid everything that was going on. KJ was so confused at that moment. It was around noon by this point. The wind had picked up significantly in the past few moments and a few clouds swirled overhead like consistent bad omens. Ruby had made her way over to the blonde girl whose name was apparently Yang, and the issei girl, whose name was apparently Nora. He wanted to go over and join her, but he could feel Era's A's begging him to stay out of whatever mess they were about to get themselves into. We should collect the artifacts and head back through the forest as fast as we can, she muttered quietly so that only he could hear. I don't like to be controlled, Era. I'm not controlling you, she spoke loudly, clearly offended. Then, he glanced over towards her and hesitantly nodded in agreement, giving the strange group of individuals one last glance before turning to walk away. It was weird because he was quite sure that Rwby looked at him, but before they could go further, they stopped in their tracks as two figures stood before them, both unflinching in their resistance. The first, more visually fearsome of the two was a brawny male with spiky vermilion hair, while the smaller one was a dainty-looking blonde girl. KJ recognized them from the airship that took them to the academy the day before but hadn't even spoken to them at the time. The girl beamed enthusiastically while the boy grunted in acknowledgement. The girl then piped up, her vocal tone displaying an almost musical quality, totally juxtaposing from the words that she quickly uttered. Unless your semblance is the speed that Deathstalker will rip you to shreds, if you don't work together with the rest of the students here, that is. Era spluttered and her eyes filled with rage. What? Exclamation mark. How dare you? Deathstalker? KJ flitted around with a speed that could rival Ruby's semblance and witnessed the creature of Grim the girl had been referring to. A huge Deathstalker, a scorpion like the monster, was chasing Paya Nikos straight towards the middle of the clearing, while the rest of the group were busy looking upwards, watching Ruby's partner and Johnny fall from the sky. Why is everyone falling from the sky again? I thought we already finished that part, KJ thought, feeling a little annoyed, and KJ did not read the way things were happening. He was a meticulous and perfectionist, and any sign of disorder put him in a bad mood. To make matters worse, he had to fight with the desire to prove his worth and that Rwby contemplated how strong he was, all because he did not know how to deal completely with his new partner, Arabosi. It worried him that they were not paying attention to a potentially fatal danger. He had always used his knowledge of the enemy to his advantage, scrutinizing their every move in order to create a combat strategy, and he enjoyed the feeling of being in control. For once, he wasn't in the driver's seat, and it had him on edge. Having to watch out for his partner was going to cost him a lot of time and power, but he had to protect her, and he had to protect Rwby, his first friend here also. He gazed over at the brutish antagonist, its huge crustacean-like claws pushing forward, ready to attack as soon as it was within range. Paya had managed to widen the gap between them, but it was only a matter of time, and that time was inevitably cut short by Ruby's battle cry. She dashed towards the grim creature, scythe unfolding in hand, her black bangs swaying frantically and her thin arms heaving from the pressure used to lift her weapon above her small frame. She sprinted with unquivering resolve, with a determined expression on her face, a look that resounded with KJ all too well. The need to prove oneself, despite being chosen from proof of talent for this very purpose. The need to show everyone that choosing them to be there wasn't a mistake. They deserved to train as future hunters and huntresses. It was the same expression KJ would make when he fights. That wasn't enough to win through. The strategy was needed. Yet Rwby was fighting out of sheer recklessness. She'll get herself killed, KJ thought in desperation. She lunged forward, but the Deathstalker struck first, landing a deafening blow on Ruby's petite body. sending her crashing back onto the hard ground. She got up slowly, yelling to her friends in the assurance that she was fine. Am I supposed to just stand here and watch her struggle? I want to help her. KJ was having an internal fight between what he really wanted to do and what he should do. He gritted his teeth in frustration, debating whether he should let her be or hurt her pride but potentially save her from a worse fate. In that moment, the blonde girl Yang had begun to rush forward in an attempt to help, but the Nevermore flying above them worked in league with the Deathstalker, shooting large black feathers towards the ground, like missiles, until Ruby's cape became trapped underneath one. Get out of there! Yang yelled at the desperate Ruby as she struggled with her cape, but it all looked to be in vain. Nobody was coming to her rescue. Nobody was going to be able to get there in time without a long-range technique. It was an instinctive action. KJ glanced at it for only a fraction of a second before making the decision to awaken his Sharingan. He took a step forward, so his face would be concealed from the three students surrounding him, and let his eyes take over, fiddling with the coin in his hand as he judged the beast's movements. Predictable, KJ thought. It was a fact that those creatures don't have a soul, but now, predicting its movements thanks to the Sharingan, KJ was sure that they can't have a brain either. He raised his pale arm out in front of his body, holding the coin tightly between his thumb and index finger. At this point, Oda had noticed he had taken matters into his own hands and was about to step forward and pull him back, but his actions occurred almost instantaneously. He flipped the coin into the air with a flourish, it then flying high into the air before dropping at increased speed back down towards his hand. As soon as it contacted his skin again, a wave of high-voltage electricity flowed from his body and careered towards the beast. The creature exploded from the sheer magnitude of energy making contact with it, the debris of its shell being flung in every direction as Ruby and Yang shielded themselves from the worst of the aftermath. To protect them from the heaviest debris, KJ released his blue flame and burned the largest pieces of shell which were flying towards the temple to ash. After a few moments, Ruby and Yang looked up, puzzled, and they quickly tried to locate the instigator of the blast. KJ didn't have time to change from his combat position before they noticed him, but was able to deactivate his Sharingan at least. He wanted to keep that power to himself until he was placed in a team. This was only his initiation after all. No need to pull out all the party tricks just yet. KJ Flanders, Ruby said slowly while rising to her feet, as if unsure if she was seeing things. KJ's fierce expression quickly turned into a gentle smile as he withdrew himself from his fighting position, shaking his head as if in some sort of daze. He waved enthusiastically while Aris scowled. Hey, Ruby, sorry I jumped in a bit sudden there. Just looked like things were getting a bit out of hand. He rubbed the back of his head apologetically and smiled sheepishly. Yang switched her gaze between the two of them in utter confusion while they both let out huge sighs of relief. Do you two know each other? She then gasped. Sis, have you actually made a friend? I am so proud of you! Exclamation mark. She jumped on top of her sister and pinched her cheeks, ruffling her hair with a huge smile on her face. Ruby looked hugely embarrassed at her sister's coddling, swatting her away as quickly as she could. Yang, KJ helped me out yesterday. Stop it, she muttered the latter part under her breath as though she didn't want KJ to hear. Unluckily for her, KJ had some really impressive hearing. In spite of his restraint, he snickered quietly at the exchange. Okay KJ, you had your fun. Now let's go. Ara pulled at his jacket in an annoyed manner, while the two other students standing beside them stood and watched with indifference. KJ momentarily ignored her to find out more about them. For all he knew, they could end up being part of his team. Knowing their names would be useful. I'm Emerald, My specialty is a brute strength, the petite blonde girl said slowly, as if to start a conversation, looking eager to join forces with him now that she had witnessed his electrical abilities. KJ Flanders, and you are? He gestured towards the red-headed man with confusion. Surely that guy was too old to be a student at Beacon. Emerald noticed his confusion and continued with her introduction. Oh, this is my older brother Robin. He got held back 3 years after an incident back home. Hey, Robin grunted unenthusiastically. Which is your specialty, Robin? KJ wanted to know, trying to make some conversation. My specialty is that is not your fucking problem. Robin, come on, KJ, please. Excuse him. He is so volatile sometimes. His ability is quite good. He is capable of controlling minds, but he needs to practice a little more. Also, his specialty is his fist. That sounds just mad. I mean, does he control a Grimm's mind? That's the dream. Era, I am sure he could do it someday. Right, Robin? Robin nodded without any emotion. KJ thought how unuseful Robin was in a combat if he was incapable of controlling the principal enemy's mind. He just hopes Robin's fist is good enough in a fight. While they were having this exchange, the other 8 students that were currently also at the temple had made their way over to them with their chess pieces in hand. Well, there's no sense in dilly-dallying. Your objective is right in front of you, Ruby's partner Vi stated with an aloof yet trustworthy look in her eyes. The 4 of them rushed to grab their pieces as they noticed the Neva more quickly beginning to circle back towards them. They joined the other students, and everyone nodded as they realized the only way to get back through the forest was to move as quickly as possible. Run and live. That's an idea I can get behind. Johnny piped up as they began to run away from the temple with their artifacts. The Neva more caught sight of its moving prey as they began to make their way over rocky terrain. It crowed and seemed to signal to some other creature of Grimm as they soon heard clacking movements begin to approach them from behind. KJ gritted his teeth and glanced up again at their aerial opponent. They had almost lost Ruby to a small death stalker. If it hadn't been for his electrical semblance, she could have been eradicated. Now the Neva Moor was perched on a large stone wall. A perfect vantage point for easy pickings like newly recruited hunters and huntresses in training. How could he have missed this villain? How had this Neva Moor evaded the fate of KJ's combat impulsivity, when it was in part responsible for all that danger? The only conclusion he could make was that he was afraid of failure. That he was indeed a coward hiding under the pretense of someone kind when he was truly a ruthless human with abilities. All this so that he could remain somewhat unnoticed until he deemed it the correct time to strike and then take down the creatures of Grimm and anyone who he considered to be tainted by the evil encompassed by Grimm. They halted as the Neva Moor released a blood-curdling screech as it stretched its raven wings in predatory wait. Ara then deciding to hide behind a boulder along with Johnny and a few others. KJ looked at them, realizing how good they looked together. Just hiding and evading action. KJ ran up beside Vice and Raven and pushed them forward, forcing them to move out of plain view. Run, he demanded as he ran in the opposite direction, their legs moving as quickly as they could possibly allow. KJ, Nora and her partner, whose name was Ren, began distracting the Neva Moor as best as they could. Ren used some form of a gun to fight, which was in this case ineffective in KJ's opinion, but in this situation, they just needed to get out of there. So he kept his mouth shut and attempted to aid them without wasting his aura on another electrical charge. He removed his dual-wielding swords from their sheath on his back and slashed them through the air to settle in front of him in an attacking position. So, this was it. The first strike decides the battle. If the opponent with the first strike plans accurately, it could win the advantage along with the battle. But if they miss, It could cost them their lives. They had to be extremely careful about this if possible. KJ wished to retain all his comrades alive. His fellow students would engage in combat against the monster while he looked for its weakness, using his swords as protection until he was able to formulate a plan against this foe. They would use this formation to stall until it was defeated, and they were able to get back to Professor Ozpin and Glinda Goodwitch in one piece. They sprinted until they reached a stone bridge leading them to the outskirts of the forest. The Nevermore circling until the perfect opportunity to separate its prey arose. It smashed the bridge in half, leaving himself, Pyre, Ren, and Raven trapped with an even larger Deathstalker approaching from behind. So, this is what had been following us. Gee, thanks for that. Nevermore, really, KJ thought. Nora and Johnny made the jump between the two bridge sections by using the force of Nora's hammer to propel them. Raven fell backward as she lost her balance but quickly used this to her advantage, using her weapon to hoist herself up onto the Nevermore and attack its flesh with a sword. Nora then got into an attacking position and prepared to lunge at the Deathstalker. Stay back. This one is mine. Era suddenly appeared from her concealment behind a large boulder and pushed Nora towards the broken bridge's edge. In a burst of fury, after finally revealing two large pistols from her belt, she pointed them toward Nora, gritting her teeth, as everyone stared in disbelief. Era, what are you doing? KJ lost his cool momentarily, fully exasperated at how at a time like this, his partner was willing to injure another student in order to stand out and potentially become the leader of a team. Ren ran towards Era and Nora in uncharacteristic frustration, taking his weapon and pointing it towards Era in a threatening manner. Nora looked between the pair in confusion and managed to slip away while Ren kept restraining Era, who appeared to have been driven to bloodlust out of overwhelming fear. Meanwhile, KJ's blades were meeting his opponent's claws in a flurry of slashing motions. Clearly, the creature was sacrificing the health of its limbs in the process of defending its weakest areas from him. However, KJ's ascended abilities using his Sharingan gave him the upper hand, and he eventually showcased his Rinnegan in both eyes. In order to use the outer path, he mustered up enough energy to create a chain made from his aura, binding the Grim while gripping his swords so tightly in his fist that his knuckles turned white. He knew he couldn't defeat the beast in his state of depleted energy unless he risked blacking out, and he couldn't damage it enough without getting a serious backlash. All he could do was keep it under control until he could no longer fight. His temporary explosive power was too much for him because wounds began to form all over his body and he grew weak and lethargic in his attempts to restrain it. He looked over his shoulder to Johnny and Pyre, who were rushing towards him and the opponent to castigate it into submission while Nora prepared to deal the final blow. She leapt forward and swung her hammer at the monster, knocking it off the bridge and releasing KJ's chains in one swift movement. Although KJ's abilities and skill were a force to be reckoned with, as was his strategic and emotionless tendencies in a fight, in this battle, he could not reach his full potential for precisely that reason. He could not activate that cruel side of his personality while fighting alongside people he wanted to befriend. Until he was able to explain himself, he could not display the full extent of his power. Naturally, he was hesitant to hold back and look weak. This wasn't how he normally fought. He had to grow close to them, find out their strengths and weaknesses so he could have the upper hand in future, and more importantly to be able to lead a team successfully. He gasped as he crouched into a kneeling position, clutching his side where an open wound had formed. Damn, my aura won't help until I heal this, KJ thought, starting to feel dizzy. He looked up momentarily and saw Ruby staring at him. obviously watching the battle which had unfolded while she prepared to take down the Nevermore. She then faced her rival with the bridge grumbling below them as water from a nearby cliff dribbled down onto the pavement from the debris caused by the ongoing struggle. Yang and Vice began their attack on the demon, allowing Ruby to catapult towards it, torturing it with a gunshot, scythe suffocating combo, dragging it up the cliff in front of them. She beheaded the Grim without a labored scream, landing on top of the height with an air of heroism they could simply gape at. Yang grinned beside Vice as she watched her sister on top of the cliff while Raven merely sighed in relief. Ruby sighed in exhaustion. Her entire mind was left numb, and she used these few seconds alone on the height to collect her thoughts. She gazed down at the Grim's falling corpse, then looked up at the overcast sky and smiled slightly with a faraway look. Let's go. The group left the forest, feeling exhausted but very satisfied with themselves. KJ wanted to reprimand Era for her behavior, and he wanted to be as far away from her as possible. On the other hand, he was very uncomfortable when he noticed that Yang's partner Blake never took her eyes off him. KJ didn't know what to think about it, and wondered if that girl had noticed anything wrong with him. That evening, Professor Oz had finally assigned the teams and leaders for the new students who had completed initiation successfully. KJ was very excited, but he was disappointed to see Ruby being named the leader of her team, a group of girls made up of Vice, Yang, and Blake. He immediately knew, once he got on the platform where Professor Ozpin was and delivered the queen pieces, that he would be reassigned with Ara. His team was now the Kale team, where he was the leader, and Era, Robin, and Emerald were his new teammates. KJ had unsurprisingly become a team leader, probably aided by the fact that his three fellow comrades used him as a shield for the entire first day. But apparently this news was not to Ara's liking, but KJ not care, as he had not attended anyone. On the other hand, Johnny was announced leader of JNPR. Those were the only groups he was remotely interested in at the time. After the eventful day they'd had, and despite the fact he wasn't in the team he had wished for, being a leader was his goal. Now it was time to show anyone who would watch that he could really be a hunter in the making. Looks like things were shaping up to be an interesting year, and KJ Flanders wasn't going to hold back anymore. Part 2. Beacon Academy was probably the most prestigious school in the kingdom, one reserved for the elite in their field of combat, both academically and otherwise. The best students in the prefecture could be found here in their minority, coming from miles around to receive the best education the state had to offer in order to become the future generation of hunters and huntresses protecting the civilized nations from the creatures of Grim. KJ Flanders wasn't the most intelligent of students. In fact, his IQ was only slightly above average at best. But he did have one thing not many other people did. He was cunning. He was well known back home for being a tough opponent to go up against psychologically as well as physically. It wasn't just adults who had changed their opinion on his in the past few years. His old friends had also begun to see him in a different light and constantly his avoiding sparring against him. However, with the arrival of a new school term, KJ had finally transferred to Beacon with the aim of helping those who couldn't defend for themselves. It was 7 a.m. The wind bustled the autumnal leaves which now had begun to litter the cobbled paths sprawling outwards from the school in all directions, students milling around the building in their masses. The sun was beginning to rise and stretch over the infamous building, its many facets filtering light and shade over the surrounding grounds. The entire atmosphere still seemed somewhat fresh. Chatter whistling through the air as a new term began. KJ walked alone with a girl called Era Blue at his heels, who now happened to be a member of his team, Kaya. He wasn't used to being constantly followed around by someone, It was practically suffocating. He felt like dashing towards the school in a desperate bid to escape her, but thought he might end up being captured and held hostage by her small grappling hands if he did so. That was the strength these girls possessed. 9 a.m. That's when he had to go to his first class with her. She had stuck by his side like hot glue since they had been partnered on initiation day, but had barely said a word since. By the time he had managed to haul himself out of bed that morning, she was already standing at their meeting point, arms folded. She immediately scowled as she caught sight of him. Probably about to tut him for being late as per usual. Late meant arriving after her, even though he'd never agreed to have Vera as a constant companion in the first place. KJ Flanders, will there ever be a day that you get out of bed before me? No, this is where you're meant to say, oh, it's okay, I just got here, right? She furrowed her eyebrows in disdain while KJ merely grinned quietly, happy to finally have a somewhat normal interaction with her. Without another word, they had begun to walk around the school grounds, as they had done for the few days separating initiation day and their first day of class. After a prolonged period of awkward silence, he plopped down on the large wooden bench situated alongside the West Wing gardens and turned to face his fellow student. A myriad of morning larks caused an incessant chirping to castigate his ears as he eyed the girl questioningly. The south-facing windows of the building behind them let morning daylight reflect from their shiny surface and subsequently blind him slightly. Taking a few deep breaths, he managed to compose himself and give off a more serious demeanor. He was still getting used to his role as leader of his team after all, and his personality didn't really suit the whole democratically pleading people to cooperate with one another kind of thing. He straightened his back and gazed at her with his regular brown eyes, and her piercing teal eyes shone back at him in a knowing manner. Her straight long hair with bangs and her pale skin contrasted next to her now reddened cheeks, flushed like blood drops in snow as she stared at her superior for a little longer than she could manage. She dropped her eyes to the floor in what resembled embarrassment. KJ chose to ignore it. He didn't feel like teasing her about something that could get in the way of their group dynamic. She was already a little difficult to work with. So, excited for the first day of class, Ara had finally decided to break the silence. Also trying to avoid the subject KJ was obviously trying to breach, in vain. Naturally, I will be after we work things out a little bit first. Ara, you know I'm not exactly a natural in this kind of positions. Her head snapped up suddenly, a look of slight surprise on her face which was soon replaced with a small smile. She looked like she was reminiscing about something. Now there are a lot of people, KJ, but sometimes you can only be ready for something when you're placed in a situation that forces you to be the person you didn't know you could become. He chuckled slightly. Where has all this wisdom been hiding? She gasped in faint contempt as he teased her. A soft smirk now gracing his face, his eyes crinkled in warmth at her light-hearted response. He was taken aback by his feeling of protectiveness over her at that moment, but as she was a member of his team now he couldn't help it. They just might be able to work together after all. You kind of ignored me during initiation. In fairness, I am looking back now and I am really glad you did. I don't know what came over me. Nerves, I guess. So, what I'm trying to say is, thanks for helping me back then, she stated, slightly embarrassed. His hand scratched the back of his head in reflex, the corners of his mouth turning upwards into his signature sheepish grin. She grinned back suddenly, her eyes closing as she chuckled softly along with him in their quiet days. They still were seated on the cold outdoor bench, completely unaware that the bells for class were about to ring. It's okay, I was scared too. Instinct causes fight or flight, or in your case, a little bit of both. Ugh, everyone must hate me. She buried her face in her hands, placing her elbows on her knees and leaning her body forward. They don't hate you. probably just think you're a little crazy. Ugh. She crouched even further in her ashamed position, almost funny, covering her entire head with her arms. "We are gonna be late," he heard a high-pitched voice screech as a large group of students whizzed past them. Professor Ozpin and Glinda Goodwitch watched from a distance, indifferent to the tirade which has just passed through the area. It took KJ a few moments to realize what this meant, but as soon as it dawned on him he checked his watch hurriedly. His eyes widened. "It's 8:58. Come on." He grasped Tara's hand and pulled her up as quickly as possible, pulling her behind him as he sprinted towards the first classroom noted on their timetable, and managing to wheeze their way into their seats by 9 a.m. on the dot, clutching the stitches in their sides as they practically crawled to the back of the class. He could see the majority of Team RWBY already dozing off, and Ruby seemed to be doodling in her notebook while Yang was seemingly refusing to look their teacher in the eye after he dared to wink at her while boasting about his past as a huntsman. Vice appeared to be getting more and more frustrated with the girls around her as the teacher began preaching something along the lines of how true huntsmen must be honorable, dependent and strategic. Eventually, this leads her to volunteer for a class demonstration in which she had to defeat a Bay Tusk. This took them until the end of class. Vice stalked off without another glance after having an argument with Ruby, while the rest of the students stood dumbstruck momentarily in the aftermath of her outburst. Looks like those girls might destroy each other from the inside. What do you think, Robin? Emerald mused quietly, seated to the left of KJ while Era sat on the right. Robin sat to the other side of Emerald, his muscular arms resting on the desk, one of his calloused hands resting his chin as he looked entirely unamused by having to get up before noon. "I don't know," he replied curtly, his eyes rolling slightly at his sister's apparent curiosity surrounding the other teams. This didn't put Emerald off, however, as she then turned to KJ and continued to pry on what the others might be up to. "What do you think, KJ? Do you really believe little Ruby can lead a team at her age? Oh wait, aren't you a little young yourself to be managing such a large responsibility?" she chimed happily, her melodic giggle making the backhanded compliment sting a little less than it should have. He tried to shift the point of conversation from Team RWBY to their own lack of cooperative skills, knowing that this was their priority if they wanted to succeed and graduate. "Don't you think we should be more concerned by how we barely even talk to one another, instead of worrying about the other team dynamics?" KJ asked, really irritated. "Maybe, but this is more fun." Emerald snickered softly, her eyes glancing from him over to where Ruby was now running after Vice in obvious concern. KJ sighed in exasperation and stood up suddenly, causing Emerald to stop and raise her eyebrows at him. He glanced down momentarily at her and gave her a look of almost parental disappointment and began to walk away without explaining any further. She needs to figure it out on her own. Unless she stops looking down on her peers, she won't be able to work with us, KJ thought. He hurriedly made his way out of the classroom, hearing a disagreement occurring just down the corridor. He was psychic, but even he could bank on it being between Vice and Ruby. Ozpin made a mistake, he heard Vice declare as they entered his field of vision. He had just turned the corner to approach them, Vice already beginning to walk away from the heated encounter, her proud demeanor rolling off her in icy waves, her aloof head held high as Ruby slumped her shoulders in defeat. KJ walked up behind her slowly, cautiously, and with good reason. Professor Ozpin seemed to appear out of nowhere from a room located down the corridor behind Ruby, and so KJ decided to stay silent and evaluate the situation further. "I feel like Emerald's habits are starting to rub off on me," KJ thought. Now that didn't seem to go very well, he stated quizzically, holding a cup of hot chocolate in one hand and a cane in the other. his eyebrows raised above his glasses as he waited for Ruby to explain the situation further. Is she right? Did you make a mistake? Ruby queried, her entire body looking a bit dejected. This was not the Ruby KJ was used to seeing. Where was the air of confidence, the fun-loving innocence? Had Vice already sapped Ruby of her energy? Maybe I have it easy with my teammates after all? That remains to be seen. Professor Ozpin laughed and gave a cryptic reply at first, though it was somehow reassuring. He continued, I mean, it's only been one day, Ruby. I've made more mistakes than any man, woman, and child on this planet. But at this moment, I would not consider your appointment to the leader to be one of them. He leaned in closer, so he could look more directly at Ruby. Do you? It didn't look like he doubted his decision, and even KJ could see the talent in those sharp silver eyes. Ruby was intriguing, to say the least. Being a team leader isn't just a title you carry into battle, but a badge you wear constantly. If you're not always performing at your absolute best, then what reason do you give others to follow you? You've been burdened with a daunting responsibility, Ruby. I advise you take some time to think about how you will uphold it. He turned his back on her as he continued talking, leaving her with some things to consider. She looked thoughtful within response to Ozpin's words, then slowly smiled at him. The headmaster walked away without another word. And that's when KJ thought it was the best opportunity to intervene. He rounded the corner he had backed behind during the latest conversation and made he was over more hastily than last time, coughing slightly to grab her attention. She swung around in surprise as he approached her, still partially pondering over Ozpin's words of solace. Hey. Couldn't help but overhear the tail end of that conversation. Are you okay? He started, halting about a foot in front of her and looking at her worriedly. She looked a little surprised to see him there, but her shocked expression soon changed to a grateful one after the initial encounter. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little internal team drama. She laughed a little in an attempt to brush it off, but the response sounded a little genuine, so KJ blinked and tilted his head back in an unconvinced manner. Ruby realized she wasn't going to convince him with that lame excuse and groaned slightly at that realization. For what it's worth, I think you'll be a great leader and a great huntress too, obviously. He placed his hand on her shoulder reassuringly, searching her gaze for any doubts that could materialize. She seemed to have relaxed a little already, and this time her smile seemed a little more genuine also. Thanks. You're not too shabby either. I noticed you pulled a couple of tricks out of the bag for initiation. What's that about? She's more perceptive, KJ thought. I don't know what you're talking about. He responded vaguely to her accusations, his eyes flitting around very suspiciously in the process. Ruby began to smirk as she figuratively had trapped him in a corner with little chance of escape. Oh come on, you can tell me, she pleaded with him, nudging him with her shoulder playfully as KJ blatantly avoided eye contact with her, looking up at the ceiling instead to avoid her watchful eyes. I may or may not have numerous abilities. Allegedly. They both couldn't help but start to giggle at the ridiculous interaction they were having, Ruby now resting her hand on his shoulder, so she could laugh uncontrollably without losing her balance. Well, I caught a glimpse of a cool electric blast thing, blue flames, and I'm almost certain your eyes went a funny color at one point, kind of like my sister's Yang's. But even cooler, she was practically giddy from her excitement over his abilities, which was overwhelmingly flattering for a guy who had admired Ruby's talent ever since he first saw her in combat. Haha, thanks. I mean what? Must be seeing things, I reckon. Nope. Yup. Nope. They continued their easygoing conversation until it was time for their next class, and by the end of the day, Ruby was even more motivated to be the best leader she could be, stating that she was going back to her room to study a bit before bed, and apparently, she and Vice made up that night. As the next day Team RWBY looked stronger than ever, unlike Team Kea, which still needed to work on their dynamic. But like Hera had said on their first day, sometimes people need to be forced into a situation before they're willing to change. And that's what happened when Cardin Winchester tried to cross KJ Flanders. Team RWBY, JNPR, and Kea sat together at lunchtimes and ate together regularly, and on this particular day the group was discussing how Johnny had been tormented constantly by a boy called Cardin Winchester, a bully that happened to target Faunus and Johnny in particular. Johnny defended his honor valiantly, insisting that he wasn't being bullied, but everyone could see the obvious unfair treatment for themselves. Johnny seems a little off, don't you think? I wonder if he's going to be able to get through the rest of this week. Never mind this semester, Emerald mused quietly, unimpressed by Johnny's apparent lack of skill which he displayed in any class duels he had completed in thus far. I think we need to worry a little more about how we are going to work together, rather than how others are going to cope. Actually, Ora defended her classmate from Emerald's skepticism, attempting to make her worry instead about her own problems. Emerald looked a bit too pleased by her rebuke, as she grinned. Oh wow, I was just thinking that too. So, I may have arranged a little picnic for us when we go on our trip to the Forest of Forever Fall later this week, so we can all get to know each other even better. Team Kea, us against the world. He deadpanned at her enthusiastic plan, knowing there had to be some sort of catch. Though he had only known Emerald for a few days, he could already tell this girl had a sadistic side he did not want to cross if he could help it. He sighed, already resigned. You've got an ulterior motive and you're going to cause some inter-team drama, aren't you? Precisely. The rest of the team groaned in unison at her response, while Emerald merely grinned evilly to tease them further. They rejoined the conversation with Johnny and the rest of their friends just as Ruby gestured towards another table in the great dining hall. Cardin's team were teasing a small Faunus, pulling her rabbit ears and tormenting her. KJ's vision went red in a moment of sheer anger and he stood up suddenly, while everyone else just stood dumbstruck at his abrupt movement. KJ Flanders was not a fan of bullies. In fact, he hated them, possibly even as much as creatures of Grimm. He believed they were tainted with that same kind of evil, except these humans didn't have the excuse of not having a soul. They were fully aware of the damage their actions could cause. From personal experience, KJ knew the kind of hurt bullies could inflict. He didn't want anyone else to go through that kind of experience, trauma, and pain. In was an instantaneous reaction. His primary instinct was to go over to that boy and teach him what it felt like to be hurt in that way. Not necessarily revenge, but merely a taste of his own medicine. He pushed back his chair and stood up, walking purposefully towards the table where that team was still hurting the girl. He didn't even notice how much bigger than him this guy was. At that moment he didn't even care. He reached out towards Cardin's face and grabbed his small human ears, pulling on them and pinching them until the blood rushed to the area of skin he was pinching, turning them red. He pulled them forcefully until Cardin winced in shock and pain. But before he could exclaim in shock, KJ spoke first. How do you like it? Do you enjoy being tormented like this? Just like you were doing to that girl? Do you think that's fair? Cardin merely gritted his teeth in annoyance and pushed back until KJ let go, unable to respond without getting another backlash. KJ then turned to see his entire group of friends staring at him. Mouth agape, they sat frozen until Yang began applauding him and whooping until everyone else joined in. He bowed in mock regal gratitude. From then on, any time he caught Cardin bullying another person such as Johnny, he would reciprocate their actions. For instance, when Cardin threw Johnny into a specialized locker and launched it into the sky using a 6-digit code, KJ then followed suit and locked Cardin's muscly, tall frame into a container and launched it even further than where Johnny had fallen. After a few days, All these fateful encounters eventually seemed to lead up to a duel Glinda-Goodwitch had officiated during training time. They both made their way into the center of the room, the rest of the class watching intently from the raised lecture hall seating. They both got into their unique battle positions as Glinda signaled the start of the match. And in an instant, Cardin was rushing towards him, all his rage at being made pay for his crimes fueling each stride. KJ meanwhile had only taken his swords out of their scabbards and was busy looking at the makeshift poster Ruby had made to support him in the crowd. He found her childish handwriting oddly endearing. It all happened so quickly KJ was barely able to process it. His hands, which were still clutching his swords, were literally encased in Cardin's vice-like grip and were already turning cold from the lack of circulation. He could move faster than KJ had anticipated, and on top of that KJ had his guard down. KJ turned immediately in shock as Cardin smirked mischievously in response, his weapon still slung over his shoulder. It seemed like Cardin thought KJ's swords was the primary target in this fight, an asset due to her extensive physicality and apparent destructive power, which meant they should be removed from the equation immediately in the eyes of an opponent. KJ did not want to use his Sharingan if possible, as he knew it would tire his aura more quickly. But if he couldn't activate his blue flame or electrical semblances, he would have no choice. His eyes furrowed as he attempted to reach his coat pocket for his quarter, to fight hesitantly, but with resolve. He didn't want to seriously harm Cardin, but if it meant retaining his pride in front of his friends, he would do whatever it took to win. He wouldn't let this type of guy get an ego boost. Not after what he did to Johnny. He refused to even imagine the consequences of losing. On the inside, he was facing pure strategic turmoil. Yet on the outside, there was a usual determined calm facade. He struggled to get out of Cardin's grip by landing a series of kicks to his stomach and legs until his hands slackened enough for KJ to get free. However, Cardin managed to block any major force behind the attacks with the end of his mace. Counterattacks were easily dodged by both students as they continued to spar. He was meticulously trying to think of a way to get the upper hand, whether that be psychologically or physically, when he heard the cheering of a girl in the crowd. "You can do it, KJ. Team care." KJ heard an enthusiastic scream of error as she punched the air with her small pale fist. Cardin's mouth dropped wide open with disbelief and KJ scratched the back of his hand in slight panic and relief as she was immediately shushed by Glinda and the rest of the class. In their brief interlude, KJ had regained his composure first and took this distraction as a time to strike. This way he didn't even need to activate his Sharingan or Rinnegan. It was simple. Surely one flip of a coin would do it. He didn't want to kill the guy, but perhaps if he restrained his energy enough it would only render him unconscious. Glinda only realized his plan when he had already taken out his quarter. "Cardin, duck," she shouted in vain as quarter flipped through the air and landed on KJ's hand, allowing a flood of electricity to be shot straight towards his opponent, which even with the warning had only missed him by mere inches as he cowered behind a pillar in the corner of the room. The wall of the building wasn't so lucky though, as a plate-sized hole had been drilled the entire way through, showcasing the East Wing gardens outside. "Maybe I need to work on controlling my aura a little more. Never mind being weak. It's not good to be too strong in a situation like this either," KJ thought. Cardin slumped to the ground, already unable to move from shock as he attempted to struggle to his feet to continue the match. It was futile. Emerald chuckled at the back of the room, seated next to her brother as she watched her teammate in this advantageous state, with Cardin practically choking in fear and unable to tear his eyes away. "Maybe we can cooperate with this team after all. What do you think, Robin?" "I don't know. Are you sure?" Emerald turned from her brother and smirked knowingly. her gaze once again intently locked on KJ's body, which had now begun to stride over to Cardin's fatigued figure. "This is for anyone you've tormented up until now." He leapt forward and swung his arm back. A flicker of recognition registered in Cardin's eyes, and he gritted his teeth in fear as KJ hit him square in the face. He then fell to the ground, muttering "lucky shot" before falling unconscious as KJ dusted off his black gloves in satisfaction. "And I guess that's the match, KJ. You should have no problem qualifying for the tournament later this year. Cardin, maybe you should work a little more on a defensive strategy. And, oh, he's unconscious. Thank you, Professor. And you, sorry about the damage. We'll talk about that after class." KJ gulped. He was going to pay for that. He could tell because of Professor's eyes. Glinda Goodwitch was one intimidating woman. Glancing up at his teams, he could see Johnny beaming ear to ear as Cardin finally got his comeuppance. That was what KJ had been hoping to see by the end of this match. That was how his morality functioned. An eye for an eye. A tooth for a tooth. That wasn't his motto, but in combat, that's how he saw things work. That's why he enjoyed training so much. There was no gray area where he had to look out for social conventions. It was pure skill. It had shaped his views of the world entirely, being able to defend those who could not yet defend themselves. He knew that only some people could handle this type of mentality and talent without letting it go to their head. He also knew that the only way to survive that was by surrounding oneself with positive influences, with strong people who would support you no matter what. That's what he liked so much about the people he had met at Beacon, like Ruby. They kept him from being a person he didn't want to be. He caught Ruby's eye as he made his way up the stairs to his team's seats at the back of the room. She had watched him compete and was now smiling proudly as his gaze met hers, and so instinctively he began to beam as well. He joined Team Care, who patted him on the back in support and waited for the next spar to begin. And at that moment KJ Flanders knew that every day he spent at Beacon was another day he wouldn't trade for all the talent or weapons in the entire world of Remnant. Initiation. The RWBY fanfiction includes OC characters, KJ Flanders Osipoff, plus Era/Emerald M/Robin, contains spoilers of RWBY V1. This is a continuation of a few previous works, which took place during Initiation Day at Beacon Academy and then subsequently followed by a fighting taking place during the first few days of this semester at the Academy. This section occurs alongside Volume 1 of RWBY Ash concurring with RWBY Chibi Episode 1, Part 3. The next few days after the fight between KJ Flanders and Cardin Winchester went by in an uneventful manner at Beacon Academy. The teams consisting of KJ Flanders and his friends simply went to their classes and hung out around the town of Vale like any other teenagers would. Team RWBY, JNPR, and K are together at breakfast, lunch, and dinner often, and interchanged who they spent most of their time with among themselves in those three groups. Ruby consistently tried to get as close to her teammates as she could, even if that meant at times prying into their business. KJ admired Ruby for that because he thought she was doing a good job as a leader. On the other hand, KJ didn't feel like he was making much progress. KJ knew that even though Era was chasing him everywhere, there were many things he didn't know about that girl yet, and the trust between them was not so palpable. On the other hand, Emerald and his brother, Robin, remained like complete strangers to KJ, as Robin usually said no more than 3 words, and Emerald said nothing but nonsense. KJ scolded himself for thinking like that and promised himself that he would try to improve his relationship with his peers, make them see that he could be a good leader too, and take an interest in them. Ruby, for her part, interfered in so many of her classmates' affairs that KJ didn't understand how the other girls could respond well to this. especially the day remembered as the day that Ruby found out Blake's most precious secret, which surprisingly was not when they found out she was a fawness. Rather, this was the really important secret. The day Ruby found Blake's copy of the novel Ninjas of Love. It was a couple of days after KJ had fought Carden and showcased a few more of his multitude of abilities, and Ruby was walking around the corridors of Beacon's dormitories after class. She couldn't find anyone on her team indoors and so decided to check if anyone was in their dorm room. She skipped down the hallway, her arms swinging by her sides cheerfully, and she quickly made her way to her dorm room at the end of the hall. She halted suddenly outside the room, her eyes flitting suspiciously from one side of the room to the other as she searched for anyone present while clutching the doorframe. After a few moments, she suspected nobody was present and shrugged indifferently. No one's here, eh? I guess I'll go check the courtyard, Ruby said, not knowing what to do next. Her voice trailed off slowly as she looked to Blake Belladonna's side of the bed on the bottom bunk underneath Yang's messy quarter of the room. Blake's shelf was strewn with a multitude of books but otherwise left spotless. So, it was strange to see an open book tucked underneath the pillow of Blake's usually pristine bed. Ruby's gaze fell upon this half-hidden oddity and she crept closer, reading the title Ninjas of Love along the hard-covered book's spine. That's strange. I wonder what Blake's reading about, Ruby thought. Ruby fully stepped inside the room and zoomed over to her teammate's bedside, crouching down to get a better look at the design of the book. It was unassuming, and a little mysterious in nature, so a look of wonder slowly developed on Ruby's face as she pondered what type of books her teammate was interested in. Probably some sort of cool, strategic psychological thriller. That's very Blake. She sneakily glanced around the room and outside to the corridor, making sure the coast was clear and nobody could catch her snooping before taking the book out from under its pillow concealment and examining it herself. She stared at the cover picture of a man and woman dressed in black, armed with blades and looking deeply into each other's eyes, under a tagline reading "No shadows can conceal the lust of one enigma for long," until she turned it around to read the description. Ruby was altogether intrigued, taking the book under her arm and bringing it outside to read under the shade of an oak tree. The weather was still warm, after all, and Vice and Yang had gotten into a fight in the courtyard, so at least that would be some form of entertainment if the book turned out to be boring. She sat down in the shade and took the book out again from under her arm. About to begin the first chapter, she glanced again at the title before opening it. Ninjas. She felt very strange holding that book in her hands because Ruby usually wasn't one of the people that used to read. She liked things fast, talked about and straightforward. She then began to flip through the pages of her new discovery, her silver eyes slowly widening and absorbing this latest information about Blake's interests with emotions ranging from amazed marvel, intense concentration, gasping shock, guilty pleasure, and shuddering glee. Little did she know KJ Flanders stood right behind her and was watching her expressions while reading the book at the same time. Eventually, Ruby got so invested in the story's theme that she decided to skip ahead a few pages to get to the interesting part. She turned the novel sideways and a picture unfolded downward to reveal a full body shot of one of the characters. KJ's mouth fell agape while Ruby eyed the imagery from top to bottom with a wide grin on her face. She gestured to the lower part of the picture comically after a few moments and snickered. Now that's a katana, so that's the kind of books Ruby is interested in. Not what I was expecting, but we'll go with it, KJ thought, feeling slightly uncomfortable. KJ, on the other hand, loved another kind of books, those related to science and even history books, which revealed the mysteries of the world where they lived, especially those who talked about the properties of the dust, KJ coughed quietly behind Rwby's crouched, drooling torso, and she jumped frantically, swiveling around to catch him crouching questioningly behind her. The blood seemed to drain from her face as she realized what the situation looked like. KJ tried to hide a smile as he saw Rwby's face taking all kind of colors because of the shame of being caught reading such books. It's Blake's book. I was just curious to see what types of books she enjoys reading, so I borrowed it and actually kind of enjoyed it. But I still, of course, totally didn't like it because of its filth. Rwby thought, totally out of control, as red as an apple. So, they both looked around awkwardly, struggling to meet each other's gaze in this kind of situation. Rwby whistled as she looked over at Yang and V1ch instead, using that as a form of distraction from her overwhelming embarrassment. They were in the middle of the courtyard at this point. V1ch had once again raised her weapon threateningly at Yang with a snarl in preparation for her next attack. Yang, in turn, raised her strong fists with a smirk, looking a lot more confident than her furious counterpart. They got into their battle-ready stances before coming at one another, V1ch swiping her blade at ducking Yang, whose curled hair somehow still managed to look pristine after each attack. Noticing the near blow to her locks, Yang attempted a punch on V1ch, who blocked it with a small glyph before swinging her sword down onto one of her opponent's gauntlets. Yang used this opportunity to smack the blade away from its wielder V1ch and left her open to a leap in the air followed by a blast from her weapons, only for the shot to never fire and result in only a click noise. Yang landed back on the ground and kept trying to punch her weapons into shooting, and V1ch stopped flinching from what she thought was an oncoming blow to look just as puzzled at Yang. She eventually smiled and laughed to herself, raising her hands to her face with tongue stuck out mockingly at the brawler until Yang realized the obvious solution was to simply punch V1ch with her fist, knocking the heiress into the air and allowing Yang to take the victory yet again. V1ch hasn't won one yet. Poor girl. Once the spar was over, KJ and Rwby had nothing else to distract themselves with, and so the embarrassment reared its ugly head once again. KJ decided to face the truth head-on and look for an explanation as to why Rwby was reading a book like that in broad daylight. So, you're into that kind of novel? I would not expect that, KJ said, trying to sound casual. Rwby's face turned bright crimson to match her clothes as she began stuttering, trying to explain herself. No, KJ looked at her quizzically, unsure if she was going to say anything else. No, nope, no, isn't that your book? I am pretty confused here, Rwby. The girl put her face in her hands, pulling her knees up to her chest. KJ did the same but placed his arms around her legs, resting his chin on his knees and staring at his comrade intently until she continued. This is not my book. I was just passing by. This is of one of my teammates. Which one? I'm not a snitch. Meanwhile, back in Team Rwby's dorm room, Blake Belladonna realized she had lost her most prized possession, excluding her weapons. She was moving around her room at an astonishing rate, looking around her bed and all over the room for any sign of the particular object, to no avail. A worried, frantic expression graced her face as she scrambled, looking for it in vain. Even after checking her bookshelf half a dozen times, she looked, again and again, hoping it would magically appear in front of her very eyes. Where is it? Exclamation mark. Blake asked herself, thinking that she was sure the location of the book, under her pillow, but the book wasn't there. The most important treasure for her, an unfinished book, had got away from her and she didn't know where to look for it. She twirled around and looked out of the window coincidentally, only to see KJ kneeling beside Rwby under a nearby oak tree. A book was laying on the ground beside them. One she recognized all too well. She got up hurriedly and made her way outside with an embarrassed face, ready to confess her guilty pleasure to her two friends. But the opportunity arose where she could get away with it blame-free. so she grabbed the chance while she could. She noticed Rwby's ashamed expression as she began to walk closer, decreasing her pace as she tried to work out what was going on between her and KJ. It looked like KJ was both shocked and yet reassuring Rwby at the same time, where Rwby was also wildly trying to defend herself in the process without giving too much away. KJ was facing Rwby, his back turned away from where Blake was now standing, around 10 meters away from them. After a few seconds, Rwby's eyes met Blake's cat-like ones, and Blake smiled nervously at her friend in response to Rwby's look of surprise. Blake pointed meekly towards the book in question, which was now tucked under Rwby's arm defensively. "Rwby, is that my book?" she mouthed silently, a bead of sweat running down her face as a wave of relief crashed over Rwby, followed quickly by a growling grimace. She pointed accusingly at Blake and KJ turned quickly to see what had caught her attention. His eyebrows raised as Rwby exclaimed in an accusatory tone, "This is filth, filth." KJ shifted his gaze between them in the utmost confusion, his head ringing from the loud blast of Rwby's condemnations. Blake has transfigured from a character of shame and anxiety to one of cunning. However, as her back straightened and she feigned a look of horror and surprise directed towards her younger roommate. "Oh no, Rwby, you really shouldn't be reading that kind of stuff. I've heard of that franchise before, Ninjas of Love, was it? From a friend of a friend, and I heard it's pretty explicit." She extended her hand, smirking slightly, and took it from Rwby's weakened grasp. A master of deception, Blake's raven black hair swung over her shoulders, and she twirled in the other direction, finally managing to rescue her prized possession. "Phew, that was close. Okay, I am going to be taking this away now then. Have a nice evening, you two." Blake rattled off as quickly as she could before speed walking away from the bear, wiping sweat from her brow as the two stared blankly in her wake. It took a few seconds before it even registered with Rwby what had actually happened, but as soon as she managed to figure it out, she choked on air and shouted after her friend and toward KJ simultaneously, "No, no, 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 it's not mine, it's hers. I am a snitch after all. It's Blake's, everyone please believe me." KJ snickered as Rwby clutched the air desperately as she pleaded innocence, while she was still hoping Blake would come back and confess. In vain, as it was already known. Team Rwby, JNPR and Kaya sat together at lunchtimes and ate together regularly. This allowed KJ to open up a little more to his classmates. But as usual, he was quite an observer, and he was more concentrated on detailing the attitude of his classmates than on showing his personality. Rwby was very much like him, but she always felt responsible for the well-being of others. Yang was much more relaxed than her sister, but also more explosive, and was able to be easily offended by anything. Vice, on the other hand, was a spoiled child, who lived with a constant need to prove her power and worth to her father. Blake, on the other hand, was a very mysterious girl who couldn't take her eyes off him wherever KJ went. This made KJ very uncomfortable, as the girl always seemed to want to say something to him, but they were never alone like that. Besides, that girl was half a cat, and part of KJ felt it was impossible to trust her, and he didn't understand why. Emerald and Robin, for their part, were deeply united brothers, but it will take a long time to break down that barrier they had, that barrier that isolated them from others. One day, they were discussing how Johnny, JNPR leader, had been tormented constantly by a boy called Card in Winchester, a bully that happened to target Faunus and Johnny in particular. Their next adventure began. "Johnny seems a little off, don't you think? I wonder if he's going to be able to get through the rest of this week. Never mind this semester," Emerald had mused quietly, unimpressed by Johnny's apparent lack of skill which he displayed in any class duels he had completed in thus far. I think we need to worry a little more about how we are going to work together, rather than how others are going to cope." Actually, Ara defended her classmate from Emerald's skepticism, attempting to make her worry instead about her own problems. Emerald looked a bit too pleased by her rebuke, as she grinned. Their next adventure occurred after Em had made a very naive suggestion during that lunchtime at Beacon. So, I may have arranged a little picnic for us when we go on our trip to the Forest of Forever Fall later this week, so we can all get to know each other even better. Team Care, us against the world. He deadpanned at her enthusiastic plan, knowing there had to be some sort of catch. Though he had only known Emerald for a few days, he could already tell this girl had a sadistic side he did not want to cross if he could help it. He sighed, already resigned. You've got an ulterior motive and you're going to cause some inter-team drama, aren't you? Precisely. Emerald looked at him a few seconds, and she grinned. She's totally crazy, KJ thought, and this thought made him smile for no reason. The rest of the team groaned in unison at her response, while Em merely grinned evilly to tease them further. It was 5 p.m. on the following Saturday. The small group had made their way to the edge of the park, far away from any quizzical gazes. Emerald dragged the unenthusiastic Robin along beside her childishly, skipping behind KJ and Era while vying for her attention. KJ and Era strolled slowly down through a makeshift path through the trees, Era carrying a picnic basket full of party treats, KJ carrying a bag full of beverages reluctantly in his right hand. Em had forced them upon him before the group's departure, stating that she didn't have enough arms to carry enough for the best party you've ever been to. It was a well-landscaped area. They walked slowly upwards as the altitude increased. They strolled lazily up towards the highest oak tree they could find, leaves still fluttering to the ground with every warm gust of wind. The sun was mulling over bright September evening skies, a myriad of colorful full-time trees enveloping the plain of grass. KJ and Era lay down on top of a soft maroon picnic blanket, Era beginning to open the picnic basket and sharing food around. KJ Flanders pulled his cloak tightly around him against the onslaught of bickering going on around him, as if that would somehow protect him from being inevitably brought into the discussion. It had been a long walk through the Forest of Forever Fall with this crowd of students, and he was already weary of Em's antics. But his pockets were filled with snacks and his bag was filled with cocktails that Em had already ushered him into carrying, so he couldn't back out now. Looking up through the canopy of autumnal trees above them, he could see the sunlight dappling through the trees as the sun began to near the western horizon, keeping the dark at bay for a few more hours until nightfall. He was quickly brought out of his appreciative daze by the high-pitched voice of his most chipper teammate. "Hey, KJ, pass the cocktails, will you?" Emerald screeched, leaning forward and grabbing the bag from KJ's grasp, throwing one bottle towards him as she searched through the bag's contents. KJ looked at her questioningly, as though unsure what to do with it. "Chug, chug, 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 chug," she yelled, tipping the bottle into his gaping mouth, alcohol sloshing down his throat before he had time to process what was going on. Era ripped the bottle out of Emerald's hand, a horrified look on her face while Em pouted at her foiled plans. They both viewed the now half-empty bottle in KJ's grip, then swiveled to KJ's shocking appearance. Era threw the sandwich she was holding in her other hand towards Em's gleeful expression. "Em," she cried, worrying over their leader's well-being. Era was a correct and respectful girl, and clearly that seemed to her like a total lack of respect, as well as a very childish attitude. For a few seconds, the seconds it took for alcohol to penetrate in KJ's system, the boy felt guilty for instantly getting drunk in front of his friends, without any consideration. "I have a bad feeling about all this," KJ thought, trying to avoid Era's disapproval look. "I did it to liven him up a bit, Era. Now we can really get the party started," Emerald said, trying to cheer her up. KJ looked at Emerald for a moment, and he appreciated the fact that she was really trying to make a bond with the rest of the team. What if something happens to him, or worse, What if Professor Ozpin finds out and throws us all out of Beacon? Or even worse than that, what if Professor V1ch finds out and we get the stare of doom? Exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Ara looked a little crazy, even funny. She was clearly overreacting, and given the fact KJ was totally drunk by now, the scene looked even funnier for him. Oh, lighten up, Emerald groaned, throwing a handful of food towards her friend, but Hera quickly dodged and missed it by inches. This, however, led to unforeseen consequences, that in the form of the once completely stoic Robin. Are we having a food fight? Finally, something I can actually win, he exclaimed, surprising his friends, grabbing an entire armful of sandwiches with his huge muscular arm, and a squeezy bottle of mayonnaise in the other. Oh, God, I thought Robin was meant to be the calm one, yet why do I feel the overwhelming urge to compete against him? Why am I gathering a pile of watermelon in my arms? KJ thought, looking at Robin. KJ was under alcohol's effects, so he wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe Robin got very mad because of this, but actually, KJ didn't give a fuck. KJ staggered to his feet, the effects of competition already starting to take its toll on him. He cackled menacingly before launching pieces of delicious fruit at his new opponent. Robin merely gasped in astonishment, dodging the pieces of watermelon as best he could, wondering how this battle to end all battles would end. Both Era and Emerald watched them in confusion as this particular war of testosterone began. This is a fight to the death. KJ Flanders, I refuse to be a side character any longer. As a minor character in the plot, you shouldn't have gotten any more time for development and action regardless. You just got so much screen time because you are somewhat mysterious. Robin gasped again, appalled at the explosive statement, and began to chuck food at a faster rate towards KJ. Emerald ran in between them both, trying to catch the flying pieces of food in her mouth. As they passed by, Romeli looked on, unsure of what to make of the particular scene, wondering how she should stop it but also becoming too tired to even try. Robin had changed from his somewhat teasing manner throughout the food fight, reverting to a serious component. He glanced over at her, saw that she was watching him and threw an even higher quantity of food towards KJ when his eyes met hers. He had also started throwing them in complex ways, flicking them under his long legs, swinging his arms around in circular motions in a comical build-up, and twisting around and around to increase his momentum before launching them across the clearing. Ara scoffed quietly but retained a simple smirk as she refused to intervene in the sudden change of events. Ara, you should join in too, Em hollered, motioning for her to participate. She shook her head noiselessly. Not a chance, Ara said, clearly upset. Emerald sulked slightly and took his bout of frustration out on the food in her hands, powerfully kicking them towards Robin and KJ in her unintentional haste. After they had finally run out of food to throw at one another, KJ slumped to the ground, defeated. Bits of breadcrumbs stuck to his brown hair and mayonnaise covered his long cloak. He took it off and loosened the top button of his shirt, panting heavily as he did so. The battle has been won, but the war is only just beginning. They sat in silence for another few moments, before Robin finally broke it with a grunt. Good game, man. He extended his fist and KJ chuckled, fist pumping his teammate with induced vigor. If we used our semblances I'd totally win. Probably, KJ smiled, feeling weird. It was the first time he actually had a good time with his new teammates. Also, he felt a kind of brotherhood that could be harvested in order to become in a good friendship. KJ immediately felt odd for being hoping that friendship and admitting that he actually needed. Robin broke into a smile and the rest of the team clasped their hands to their mouth in astonishment at seeing Robin express an emotion that wasn't indifference or annoyance directed at his sister. Well, I should say it was worth it. I mean, I didn't enjoy wasting food, but at least Robin is smiling," Eris said, trying to get into some conversation. But Robin ignored his comment, and immediately stood up, as KJ turned to one side and his heart froze as he saw a Grim heading toward them. It was like a bear, black as midnight with slashes of blood-red fur across its body, but it was at least 10 times larger than any regular bear he had ever seen, an Ursa Major. Not good. The great beast came crashing down a few paces away. Side-like claws raked the ground, the fur bristling at the creature's neck as it drew back what resembled its lips to reveal teeth like daggers. A thick, drool-like substance dripped from its mouth, hissing and smoking as it scorched the grass, even as the team care tried to comprehend what they were seeing. Their eyes were drawn up in horror by the enormous number of armored spikes lining its entire body. Eris scrambled backward, not daring to look away as she was closer to the creature. It padded forwards, its muscular body rippling, and its eyes boring into that of its prey. KJ could hear its harsh breath rasping in its throat, as though its lungs were great bellows. The first attack hit KJ's chin before he could even see it coming. He noticed too late that it was a feint, though. When the second attack doubled him over and expelled the last bit of choked air from his strong core, outside of having the wind knocked from him, KJ noticed a fair amount of pain expelling from the point of contact, which was something he wasn't used to when faced with normal blows to the stomach, a hit to the face, yes, or even the groin, but the gut shouldn't have been much more than discomfort if that. That was when he realized the beast had snagged him with his claw in the process, and that a long wound had formed across his entire belly which was now starting to ooze blood and pus at a worrying rate. Yep, I was right. This is definitely not good, KJ thought. The boy tried not to be controlled by the fear, which spread like poison ivy all over his body because the boy was aware of how drunk he was, and how slow his movements were. Now, what had seemed like a foolish thing to do had turned out to be the biggest mistake of his life. Seeing that way, KJ stood straight, eyes narrowed with concentration as stared at his opponent, while his teammates backed him up. Emerald rushed to his side when she saw his wound and pushed him back, taking his place. KJ was about to argue, but Emerald gave him a strict sideways glance. "We're a team here, a team, remember?" Emerald looked at KJ in an unusual way. It was at that moment that KJ realized that he used to attack alone, and that's not what leaders used to do. Leaders worked as a team with their peers, and leaders don't make stupid decisions, like getting drunk and endangering their peers. He shut his mouth at that. It was true, and after that blow, he felt a bit sluggish. KJ knew the second that the creature launched his attack, they would need every ounce of their aura to overcome it, which meant he needs to heal as fast as he could to help the others. Em had a spry smirk on her face as she ducked blow after blow, leaving KJ astounded by her bounds of agility. Before KJ could even register the dodge, she had made another one. "Without my Sharingan, I can't even see what she's doing. Is this her semblance?" KJ thought. However, she could only last so long. Great claws gouged the ground as the creature of Grim bounded towards her, screeching ferociously. It looked as though she was sensing Ursa's movements using her semblance, whatever that was. But once she had lost her balance, it was able to produce another body shot. This one to Em's ribs, sending fresh ripples of pain through her torso as she flew back into a thick oak tree. She didn't fall unconscious, but she still looked too damaged to continue in the fight anytime soon. The Ursa went in for another attack. Robin jumped in and shoved the Ursa off with a weirdly strong pulse he had generated from his sword's blade. He covered the distance between them, threw 3 more pulses that landed. The Ursa was significantly pushed back but grew more and more agitated, thrashing ferociously and howling in anger. But Robin persisted. and now Arya came forward to back him up, but still they looked severely outnumbered as Robin began to grow tired. Then, Arya screamed because she was the first one who saw another large Ursa that appeared from behind the first one. It was unreal. Between the pain in KJ's guts and ribs and the general confusion of how this had unfolded so quickly, the sight of another Ursa Major appearing after KJ and Dem had already been drained of their aura was not something he wanted to see. Robin threw another pulse at the first beast, but it was having less and less effect. Then he tried another that the Ursa dodged, and responded in turn with an attack of its own. The second Ursa came pounding towards Robin, its slavering mouth gaped wide, spitting deadly drool, its yellow fangs curved like greatly curved daggers. Its armored body moved at an astounding weight despite its size. KJ knew he had to do something if their team was going to get out of this forest alive. He had to use his ace card to get them out of this one. Just a little while longer. Just hold on a little while longer, Robin. Ara, just a bit more time so I can recover enough aura, JK thought. Robin. Duck. Ara pushed her comrade aside and shot the Ursa with her handgun to distract it momentarily as the creature had reached for Robin's neck. KJ had to act now. This was his moment. He could not let his companions perish because of him, much less Robin, the boy who seemed to be his next friend. KJ said he didn't have any more time. Their time was up. I hope I have enough energy for this. Please. Please have enough energy for this, KJ. You can't let your team down now. Tension crawled up from KJ's gut to the top of his throat, causing him to gulp anxiously. He struggled to his feet, placing his hands on the ground to push himself upwards, catching the attention of his teammates, who looked shocked to see him move. Never mind stand. Despite all the pain he felt, he was moving by will and by the desire to save them. He rustled into his jacket pocket and took out his weapon of choice, his quarter, and flipped it at supersonic speed into the air. He placed his palm on the ground and waited for the coin to toss, finally coming to land on his thumb. Immediately, iron molecules from the earth combined and shot from the ground round both Ursa, encapsulating them in a clad iron cage, each bar twisting around one another to resemble a metallic bush of briars. This is it. You'll receive the pain every creature of Grim deserves, KJ said, feeling relieved. Blue flames erupted from KJ Flanders' weakened state, but his bright eyes burned scarlet as huge waves of energy poured out from every cell of his body. His demeanor was completely changed from his usual easygoing, gentle state. He was an altogether different person, bloodthirsty, serious and even cruel, and what it was worse, he hadn't any control over his body. The huge mass of energy first gathered like a protective barrier around him, but with one swift motion, his arm swung forward and controlled the flames, bringing them plunging forward into the large makeshift cage. Screams erupted from inside the encasement as the creatures burned under KJ's wrath, the flames licking their armored skin until they had a slow, painful death and dissolved out of existence. The cage melted and burned alongside the creatures until there was nothing else but a thin dusting of ash layering the forest floor. Then the breeze blew away the ashes, quite indifferent to what the K team had experienced. The four of them lay panting in the fight's wake, still dazed by what was meant to be a regular picnic. KJ felt how he was slowly becoming a normal person again. He realized it was because a few seconds ago, he knew he was capable of kill someone and enjoy it. But no. He felt there was the only room in his chest for the fear he was feeling. What just happened? A confused-looking Era finally said, looking around to her fellow students in a complete daze. Everything remained in silence until Robin joined her. And how the hell did you do that? Robin panted, gesturing towards KJ and then to the general area where both Ursa Majors had been killed just seconds previously. He felt the judicious look of his friends and he instantly closed himself. He hates this kind of look. He hates those eyes that are just judging and feeling fear after realizing KJ was a killer machine. Maybe I can deny everything, or maybe I can pretend that I was using dust the entire time. What do you mean? Do what? He asked in a fishy tone but trying to sound worried. You know what? Robin deadpanned, looking at KJ with an expression that read don't even try getting out of this one man. That made him feel even more nervous. Spill. Em pitched in, jumping up from her injured position at the bottom of the large oak tree. A bit of gossip can work wonders for the health, and Em sure does love gossip, I guess. Ah. KJ scratched the back of his head nervously as the three others circled around him, pushing him up against a tree as they searched his now regular eyes for answers. Their eyes narrowed at his unwilling response and they pried further, growing tired of the mystery surrounding KJ Flanders and his inventory of powerful abilities. KJ didn't want to lie to them, so he decided to simply state a true fact while failing to refer it back to himself instead. You can do a lot of powerful things like that by using dust. Now Robin was even furious with his new friend with that answer. You can't even remember to bring your books to class every day, let alone haul all that dust around. Repressed him, mocking him slightly. Damn. She knows me too well. Hey, he reacted with an exaggerated gesture of clutching his chest in pain to attempt to distract them from the topic at hand. You wound me. Merely blew a raspberry in response, chiding him slightly. Well, what's the real reason? We are part of a team now. I need to know everything you are capable to do. Robin agreed, recovering his characteristic sharp voice. Can't a man have his privacy around here? Never! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. They responded in unison, causing KJ to sigh and finally give in to their constant nagging. It was about time anyway, he supposed. And they were his team after all. We are part of a team now. I need to know everything you are capable to do. Robin agreed, recovering his characteristic sharp voice. May as well give them something to talk about. He sat down at the base of the tree, sliding down until his body reached the hard ground. He raised his hands in defeat, signaling them to sit down around him, allowing himself to finally give them some information about what he could do, almost the full extent of his abilities. Okay, you got me. But this just stays within Team Kea, okay? I don't want anyone else to know about my abilities just yet. We're intrigued, they once again said in unison. That isn't at all creepy, guys. He began to explain everything to them. I have 4 main abilities apart from my dual wielding. You've already seen most of them. I just never explained them up until now. There's the electricity, obviously. That allows me to shoot long range and control iron from underneath the earth. Is that what you were doing earlier? Ara questioned, her head cocking to the side in curiosity and a slight twinge of wonder. Exactly. Then there's the blue flame semblance that I just did. That was a little scary. Man, Robin shuddered uncharacteristically, and the other girls nodded with agreement, obviously also taken aback by KJ's bloodlust. Haha, sorry, I don't really use it that often. Power goes to my head, I guess. I also have some other uncommon traits. He struggled to explain them, as though unsure how to broach the subject. They were really rare after all. Not even recognized as semblances by most lay people of the 4 kingdoms, as so few people had ever come across these powers. It's your eyes, isn't it? Em piped up, giggling quietly at KJ's loss for words, as though his powers had been obvious the entire time. What, H? How did you? Oh, please. Do you think I hadn't noticed? It's not hard to detect when your entire eyeball turns red or gray, you know. Well, I guess now that you mention it, KJ pondered whether more people had noticed his eyes before, but Hera and Robin looked as shocked as he had anticipated. Perhaps Emerald was naturally this perceptive, or maybe the other two were just surprisingly late to catch on. Either way, it was difficult to hide anything from Emerald's steely gaze. Those beady eyes seemed to be able to detect anything within a 3-mile radius. They all stood up simultaneously and slowly picked up their belongings which had scattered since the picnic which had seemed so long ago. KJ knew the conversation about his powers would continue for the entire walk home, but at this point, he was ready to tell them what his eyes were referred to as, but not the wide range of things they could be used for. Anyways, that's the Sharingan and Rinnegan. They're pretty useful, but I am not telling you what they do yet. Got to keep some cards close to my chest. But we're your team, they cried as he defended himself against their onslaught. Keeping his last shred of mystery intact, he liked having a little bit of mystery surrounding him. It made him feel more protected if anything. They were almost back at the academy by this stage, so KJ knew he wouldn't be badgered too much more about it. His mood lightened considerably, and he teased them jokingly in response. All in due time, my friends, all in due time. Hey everyone, a giddy voice emerged from inside the entrance of Beacon's main door as Ruby walked outside to greet them. How was the Team Care bonding picnic extravaganza? Hey Ruby. It was an extravaganza, KJ said pointedly, making Ruby look even more curious than she normally did. And that was a lot anyway. Ruby then continued with what she had wanted to ask as soon as she had set the track on them entering the Beacon grounds again. I was just walking around, minding my own business as per usual, and I couldn't help overhearing you discussing KJ's abilities over here. So, care to explain how you managed to get more than one semblance? Ha. Not really. What? Ruby too? Come with me, Ruby said. W.H. where Ruby grabbed KJ's arms and dragged him away with alarming speed and strength, not even allowing him to form a coherent sentence of rebuke before he was pulled away from his team, who simply stood there without showing any signs of trying to save him. Ruby pulled him down a long corridor near the dormitories and eventually stopped, KJ trying to catch his breath as though he had just been winded, clutching his side until he had the ability to breathe normally. You're not going to let me get away without answers, are you? He gasped as he regained his composure, glancing up at Ruby in an utterly defeated stance. He was going to have to repeat his confession all over again. He dreaded to think of how quickly it would travel around the school that he was freak or something. He just wanted to be seen as a normal guy. It didn't matter if he had an arsenal of tricks in the war zone. It didn't change who he was as a person. The only problem was, it changed everyone's opinion there if he did. That's how it worked here at Beacon. There was almost this kind of hierarchy, with people like Pyro and himself at the top and people like Duane on the bottom. It wasn't fair, but it was the truth. So, he didn't want to be put on a pedestal unable to reach his friends. Nope was Ruby's obvious reply, as she crouched down beside his hunched figure and gazed at his face intently, waiting for him to speak. You, KJ groaned wearily, slumping down against the cold brick wall behind him. Ruby sat down next to him. A patient smile etched across her face as she waited for him to start talking. He didn't start, so she provoked him a little further. Why have you hidden your powers for so long anyway? They're awesome, like really cool. She buttered him up, complimenting him and nudging his ribs with her bony shoulders. KJ chuckled softly and nudged her back, eventually taking down his cool frontage and letting down his guard around her. Thanks, Ruby. I guess I'm just a bit afraid. Afraid of what? She looked worried, possibly even desperately so as she reached for his hand. KJ let her hold it and squeeze it reassuringly. Despite their initial embarrassment, They didn't let go. They needed a moment of quiet to get away from everything. So much had happened in so little time, from the early invitation to Beacon Academy, to moving here on an airship and meeting all their new friends, the fighting of an Evermore and a Death Stalker in the Emerald Forest, fighting Cardin Winchester and his bully minions, finding out Blake's deepest, darkest secret. Getting to know one another was possibly the strangest and the most interesting part of all. They wanted to have normal shoulders, normal elbows, and normal knees. They just wanted to do what they did well, but not be seen differently for it. If anything, Ruby understood KJ Flanders better than anyone else. So, he decided to tell her what he was most frightened of. Afraid that everyone else is going to be terrified of me. Afraid that everyone will view me differently, like I am too good for them or something, or that I don't understand what the struggles of being a student at Beacon are like. Ruby looked downwards, a nostalgic glint reflected in her silver eyes. I see. Stupid, right? KJ tried to lighten the atmosphere as it had gotten pretty heavy. But Ruby barely seemed to listen to his defensive reply, still musing over his previous confession. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, choosing her words carefully in advance. Maybe, but maybe that's okay. You need to be able to work through this with the help of your friends. KJ, it's okay to talk to us, you know? We want to listen and help, but we can't do that if you close yourself. We can't help if we don't know what you're thinking. So maybe next time you'll let us know instead of worrying all by yourself. KJ felt the warmth of Ruby's words radiate off her, and he seemed to absorb it somehow since his whole body felt calmer. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks again, Ruby. She smiled back at him, a soft, upturned smirk transforming quickly into a devilish grin. KJ immediately got anxious at whatever she was planning. Well, it's not like you could beat Crimson Rose anyway. Wait, what? KJ stood up, aghast at her claim as she sneered evilly at him, reaching behind her to take out her folded weapon in a joking yet still somewhat threatening manner. Hee, I challenge you, KJ Flanders, to a duel. KJ chuckled, joining in on her game with induced excitement. Oh, you're going down. Prepare to feel the wrath of Ruby Rose, she yelled. And they both sprinted down the corridor and made their way outside to finally find out who was the real talent at Beacon Academy after all. And so, the battle commenced. Two prodigies in their combat stances. End of the line. One last stop. Though he'd heard it described as the last battle, KJ and Ruby would simply refer to it as the most epic fight in all of history in years to come, having to call the last round of the fight something close to drawing since it took place just before dinner. And what a fight it was, packed with action, tension. Even a few fans consisting of Team RWBY, JNPR and Care gathered to either support them or roll their eyes at their antics. And yet at that moment the only person he found worthy of his attention out of the whole bunch was his opponent, who stood in a fierce stance opposite his own with her scythe glinting in the late evening sun. Are they fighting? I thought they were friends. KJ heard Yang's voice over all the voices. Maybe this is the end of their friendship, another voice suggested. This was crazy. KJ knew it. Crazy didn't mean the three sharp weapons used. The dual-wielding swords and his opponents, the Crimson Rose, hadn't gotten severely blunted from the blows that day. Those blades looked almost pink from where in the dying light. He made brief eye contact with his opponent, Ruby, who only smirked at him. He didn't want to admit that speed gave Ruby the edge, but it had. Go Team RWBY, Yang screamed as Ruby made her first move, disappearing and reappearing in front of KJ with incredible speed. He activated his Sharingan in order to cope with her semblance, but she had already decided to strike the first blow. He barely managed to bring up his arms to use his swords for protection before Ruby's scythe came crashing down against them, clashing loudly metal against metal, and they were off. The crowd gathered around them, shield back as KJ's opponent Ruby, all youth, and lean muscle, leapt cat-like from the bench behind them, waving her hooked blade in figure eights multiple times before touching down on the ground again. KJ cracked a smile. This time, he made sure to make eye contact. For a brief moment, he could see uncertainty in his Ruby's eyes. He felt grateful for the advantage he had now been given. Advancing. Ruby decided to charge at him again with her crimson rose blade upheld, going to her foreswing and following it with a backswing. KJ dodged the first and met the second with his left hand clutching his sword. The weight and force of the thing sent his opponent's blade back, but not far enough to knock the blade free of her hands. Striking, an arching shot by Ruby finally managed to slice the fabric of KJ's shirt at the midsection. It missed the flesh behind it by perhaps a centimeter. KJ knew he would have to finally get serious, jumping up suddenly and searching for something metal to climb. Perfect. The corner of Beacon's west wing was supported by a tall vertical steel iron beam, which KJ rushed towards before Ruby could get another swing in and potentially win the match. "What are you doing? Stop running away!" Ara screeched ironically from the sidelines. KJ shot her an exasperated look as she continued to run, making her close her mouth. Embarrassed in response, he reached the iron frame and began to sprint upwards into it, not even using his hands to climb 5, 10, then 20 meters or so. Ruby looked up, stunned as he literally stood horizontally, his feet seemingly stuck to the metal. Just another trick he had managed to keep to himself thanks to his electrical prowess. Ruby staggered in shock. KJ jumped from the height and swung. His sword missed as she'd only just managed to dodge it. She managed another smirk, this time at the spreeness of her dodge. KJ had to admit it was impressive, but this time, the sight only made him more determined to show Ruby he wasn't all party tricks, that he had great swordsmanship as well. Swing. They continuously struck blows at each other's weapons but always missed flesh. The heavy weaponry acted their opponent's defenses as easily as air, struggling to break through each other's hold. Both fighters soon dropped to a more defensive strategy, with barely enough energy to stand, but continued trying. Ruby rose. KJ Flanders. "My office now." Both KJ and Ruby looked up to see that their band of supporters had completely vanished from view, and in their place stood a highly intimidating and altogether unpleased figure of Professor Glinda Goodwitch, her hands on her hip in an authoritative manner. Both parties gulped at the sight and grimaced slightly before looking at each other and feeling sorry for themselves. Beacon was the real winner of this battle, even though Ruby and KJ deemed any detention they received totally worth it for one of the most trying yet exhilarating days they did so far at their new home. Although many people admired the fight, there was only one person who reacted differently to it. KJ would have expected Era to claim him for such an exhibition, but since the encounter they had with the Grim on the picnic's day, the girl had stayed a little distant from him, and KJ had noticed the change. Of course, he was worried about his friend's new stance, and he knew they would have to talk about it, but when he tried, KJ was intercepted on the stairs by that curious girl, Blake. Blake looked at him for a few seconds with her cat-like eyes, full of feeling. KJ could almost imagine the cat tears that were supposed to be on her head, only hidden by a bow tie, and KJ asked himself in those seconds why the girl liked to hide her true identity. Who was Blake Belladonna, besides being Ruby's friend who liked to read ninja love novels? KJ Flanders. KJ noticed that the girl's eyes looked watery and that she had difficulty speaking. "Is something bothering you?" KJ dared to ask. Blake gathered some courage, sighed and began to speak quickly. "I know who you are, okay? It's not that difficult. I know people here maybe doesn't know anything about you, but I do. Flanders, I had seen you fighting. In the beginning, I thought I was crazy. But days passed and I have seen your combat skills and all those abilities are incredible. But all of that came for a reason. I know you are not normal. You must be the son of the famous huntress, Ariel the Faunus. Is that right? I need you to be honest with me. I don't know what you are talking about, KJ said immediately. His temper was boiling as hot water and he didn't know how to control himself. He couldn't believe how Blake was talking to him like that. How she dares. She isn't his friend. She is no one to him. A complete stranger that just popped up and pretend to unlock KJ's past? No, he won't permit it. He didn't come to Beacon Academy to talk about something so horrible and sad for him. His past. I just said I need to be honest with me, okay? This is very important, KJ. This is more important than what you feel. I know that maybe you don't want to talk about it, but it's for the greater good. You are a smart kid. KJ stepped back, feeling very humiliated. Blake, I am going now. We are not having this conversation. Of course we will, Blake screamed, surprising KJ. She looked quite desperate, and just about to cry. I am a Faunus too, you know? That means you and me are quite similar. I know you are not a Faunus, but you clearly have the power of one. You clearly are like a flag, like a stream of inspiration for all those people outside that suffer from the mistreatment of Faunus in our world. KJ's mind became completely clouded. The hatred and pain clustered within him did not make him think clearly. He didn't need to remember his past. He didn't want to remember his past. He did not want that strange girl to come out of nowhere and say all those things to him. To speak of her mother with such property, as if she had been as important in her life as she was to his. KJ felt the tears threaten to run out of his bowls but tried to hold them as long as he could. Instead, he let out all his anger. I need your help, KJ. Please. Your mother was the White Fang's flagship. If they recover that faith, they're evil. My mother wasn't a flagship, he muttered, very upset. Yes, she was. She was the most incredible and powerful person that ever existed. I am truly sorry for what happened to her. But there's still some hope because I decided to enter Beacon, following her path, and we have you, KJ. You are the living proof that Faunus and humans can coexist together, can even love each other. You can't run for what's inside of your blood. You came here and talked to me like if you have met my mom, like if you knew anything of us, but you don't. Belladonna, I won't be any help for you now. I don't want anything related to that bunch of thieves you call the White Fang. I am not a Faunus, okay? Fight your own wars, Blake. I won't do it for you. And he just left her there, with a lot of tears in her eyes. KJ ran for the academy, trying to escape from Blake, trying to escape from his past. The boy ran around the academy's amphitheater, trying to ignore the students passing by and staring at him. Stunned, he needed air, so he ran to the outside grounds, trying to breathe and calm his mind. It was then that a hand rested on his shoulder, and when KJ turned around, Ara was surprised to get it in such a deplorable state. The boy kept crying. His eyes were very red, trying not to drown in so many tears, and his face was permanently red, with the sadness tattooed on your being. KJ couldn't it anymore, and he hugged Ara tightly. The girl was surprised, and she reciprocated the hug with great uncertainty, feeling the boy sink his tearful face into her neck. It's going to be okay, KJ. The girl spoke, not understanding what was happening. It's just that. But KJ couldn't talk anymore, because the moans of pain wouldn't let him say a word. If he wasn't prepared to talk about his past, Ara would make little difference. SHH. You don't need to talk, KJ. Everything will be fine. Ara lulled him into her arms like a baby, without asking for any explanation. KJ felt very grateful to her because she didn't oblige to talk. They remained embraced for a long time. KJ felt it like an eternity, until finally, feeling a little embarrassed and uncomfortable, he let her go and gave her a sad look. To her surprise, Era looked very serene, something unusual for her, because she was too bossy and she needed to control everything and everyone around her. "Are you okay?" Era asked with a simple smile. KJ was so engrossed, he glanced at his friend's electric blue hair for a few seconds before answering. "No," he said without explanation. "Me neither." She then sat down under the oak tree. Ruby once did it, and KJ followed her. "I was looking for you because I thought we need to talk. I know I am not the type of person you like to have around, KJ. I have seen you really enjoy the company of another kind of person, like Ruby. Ruby seems nice and outgoing. On the other hand, I like to spend my time with another type of person too, someone more open and organized. But we are a team, KJ. Since the first moment you were named my leader, I felt the huge responsibility that fell under your shoulder, so I just decided to make things easy for you, spend time with you and know each other so damn good that any enemy wouldn't stop us, ever. Why are you telling me all of this? It sounds you want to go away and end our relationship." Era laughed a bit with his worried tone. "I have been acting strange since the picnic day because I am scared, KJ. That day, I know something terrible could have happened. I know neither of you paid attention to my words and then, all that madness happened. I am scared because that day you proved to me you are not my leader, you are my hero. You saved me. And that feeling of debt is something that just grows every time I am with you. I am scared because the day I felt that it wasn't a human who saved me. It was a monster I don't know, but I admire, a monster that could save me twice. But I am the responsible now to fill your aspirations. If you are so powerful as you proved us, then I must be the most powerful gun shooter that ever existed. I want to feel I deserve to be in your team." KJ wasn't prepared for her words. His heart sank deeper, moved by the despair and sadness he felt at the time. Era had definitely chosen a terrible occasion to tell him all that, and his eyes filled with even more tears as he understood that Era was his real companion, and she was willing to give up everything for him as a team. She had even called them her hero, even though she considered them a monster as well. "Thanks for everything, Era. Thanks for talking to me and made me understand why you were acting oddly with me. But I want to promise you something. I know I don't like to be controlled, but I promise that since this day I will hear your words of advice. I will consider you as the wisest of all of us because despite your bossy tone, I know you are always saying the right things." This time it was Era who gave him a warm hug, and KJ felt a new bond formed between the two of them at that moment, a bond he was really needing. However, as he hugged Era and felt her comical pumping marshmallow scent, a thought flashed through his head. She said I was her hero. I have been the hero many times because I care for people. Maybe Blake was that desperate because she needed a hero too, and I just ran away from her. The end. What's coming next? KJ decides to help Blake Belladonna. He, with the help of Era, go to meet Blake and Son. They face the White Fang together, and Ruby and Penny show up to help them too. KJ finds out more about the White Fang and commits to getting more involved, in honor of his mother. However, he still refuses to talk about her and his past. Classes continue and KJ leaderships, and the connection with his team grows by leaps and bounds, even much faster than Team RWBY. Bonus! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark!